Even as a teenager, Angus Robertson Sinclair was a sexual deviant. No woman or girl safe in his company.
A psychiatrist report from the Times said that Sinclair would in fact not respond to psychotherapy, and the report clearly stated that he thought that this man would always be a danger to the community.
He was obsessed by sex, and he was prepared to use violence to get it.
In 2014, Scotland again came face to face with a monster. The question, how many women had he actually killed? Could anyone get inside the mind of a serial killer? The sun sets as a man drives a woman from the city. When he gets to open countryside, he drags her, probably unconscious, into scrubland. Her name is Mary Gallagher, and what Angus Sinclair is about to do to her will remain secret for nearly 20 years. It is also the latest in a series of attacks on women and girls that he's mounted since he was a teenager. One day, the 16-year-old Angus Sinclair follows a little girl called Catherine Rehill. Just 7, she's from the neighbourhood. He asks her to go on an errand and then to return to his parents' flat. When she gets there, he will pounce.
He lured this little girl back to his flat and he began his attack. The extraordinary part about all this is that there was a knock on the door while he was attacking her.
Will he panic? Might the visitor save her life? The adolescent Angus answers the door.
He'd bound her, he'd gagged her, and yet he was able to talk to somebody at the door calmly and to say, "Look, just come back when my mother's back."
Equally calmly, Angus walks back upstairs, enters the room, and turns to the girl.
This little girl must have been absolutely terrified, and yet he went back and continued.
Catherine, just 7 and a family friend, was to suffer a pattern of merciless behaviour that Sinclair would repeat decade after decade.
It was incredibly early in his criminal history, but that modus operandi that became known as the Sinclair MO was already apparent. He bound, he gagged, he raped, and then he strangled with whatever was at hand. And in this case, it was a bicycle in a tube.
Within half an hour of meeting the teenage Angus Sinclair, Catherine Rehill is dead. Throughout the grisly episode, Sinclair remains cool. He stays that way when questioned.
One of the most, I think, chilling aspects of Sinclair was how cold and callous and composed he was. He actually phoned the police to say that there was the dead body of a little girl on the stairs of his apartment block. Now, he'd killed this little girl, but he called to report it, never confessed to it, and he was able to do this as calmly as he was reporting the most basic of things.
He said that a wee girl had fallen down the stairs, but we know he must have thrown her down the stairs after killing her, which shows us that he had the composure, even at the age of 16, to make up a story of this kind and deliver it to the police.
Police and psychiatrists already knew about the young, menacing Angus Sinclair.
He'd committed what was then known under Scottish law as lewd and libidinous acts against an 8-year-old girl, so he was very well known to the authorities by the time he killed Catherine.
Angus was calm when police began to question him about Catherine's death. He was not going to confess easily.
Police began to suspect Sinclair. They began to poke holes in its story. It was clear that she'd been strangled, and it was clear that she'd been raped. She had not died just falling down the stairs.
This is a big moment in the story of Angus Sinclair. Police could prove that Catherine had not died from a fall, as Sinclair had reported. She'd clearly been strangled. But how could they prove it was Sinclair? Without a confession, he might get away with the rape and murder of little Catherine. What drove this young man? Hayley Quivinyami Smith is a forensic artist tasked with providing images of people based on scanned evidence. She offers a more human interpretation than a simple mugshot, one taken in different times.
Interviews were not recorded in those days, so a great deal of pressure could be brought upon a suspect, and quite possibly they tried a great deal to get a confession out of Sinclair, but in this case it was not effective. He stuck to his story.
What follows was a scene which would be repeated throughout the life of Sinclair, a showdown between interrogator and killer.
Sinclair was so in control. This was the 60s in Glasgow. We're not talking about police interrogation being necessarily gentle or quiet. These people were professionals. They would have gone on him hard.
He wouldn't budge from that story. They poked holes in what he said. They pointed out where she'd been found at the bottom of the stairs. They pointed out the evidence of the way she died. He wouldn't move. He wouldn't change his story.
He kept his cool and he refused to confess. He did not say a thing.
Detectives were amazed at the young Sinclair's ability to stonewall, to give nothing away, and so they turned to Angus's older brother, John. He was no stranger to rebuking the younger Angus. The boy's father had left the family years earlier, so John had been forced to play the father figure role.
From what anybody can tell, John was the only person that had power over his brother Angus, but there was absolutely no love lost between those two men. In actual fact, John, to this day, hasn't told his grandchildren that Angus is even related to them.
Police looked to John to get Angus to confess.
John described his brother as cold, emotionless, as a wee boy who showed absolutely nothing. He always had said and maintained that he was a bad sort, this kid. He was more than willing to help the police when they really needed that confession for the 1961 killing. He was there and he helped them.
John was allowed into the interview room, and he pushed Angus to confess if indeed he had done it. And he might have expected his brother to break down in tears or at least show some kind of emotion, but he did not. He resisted all attempts to persuade him to confess.
If you have done this, it is wrong and you must confess. This is probably where he's more likely to listen, more likely to take heed than with anyone else in his life.
And then, calm as you like, he confessed. He said, "Yes, I did it."
So he had finally confessed, under pressure from his brother, to do the right thing. But could the teenage sex attacker and murderer ever really change? Would any female ever be safe in his company?
The original psychiatrist report actually states that this man will be a threat to society, will be a danger, and I quote, from now onwards. There's no time scale. They're basically saying that this person, there's nothing you can do about it. It was unequivocal in the psychiatrist report.
Sinclair was convicted of the murder of Catherine Rehill and given 10 years in prison. The sentence was a reflection of his age. At 16, he was considered legally a child himself. However, he had become a very dangerous individual, and with parole, he might be back on the streets before too long.
What could you do? He was a 16-year-old boy. You can hardly lock him up and throw away the key.
It was inevitable that Angus Robertson Sinclair would one day be released, still obsessed by sex, still capable of killing, and still young and strong enough to overpower a woman if he wanted to. Who would be his next victim? In 1967, 6 years after being sent to prison and aged 22, Angus Sinclair was released. Was there any suggestion that he'd somehow reformed?
There was an attempt to rehabilitate him. The prison services actually trained him. They gave him a trade in painting and decorating so that perhaps when he came out of prison, he would have, be able to try and create a new life.
Sinclair would eventually find work as a painter. For now, the late 60s in Glasgow, he seemed to be leading an ordinary life.
He actually married a young trainee nurse called Sarah Hamilton. They had a baby, they settled down, and he became great friends with his brother-in-law, Gordon Hamilton.
Between 1970 and 1977, Sinclair seemed to have stopped offending. His work record was good. By the mid-70s, he seemed a reformed character. Friends described him as personable. His drinking buddy and brother-in-law was often seen by his side. On a chilly October evening, Angus Sinclair and his brother-in-law Gordon Hamilton head for Edinburgh, about an hour from Glasgow. Sinclair had been out of prison by now for 7 years. He was living the life of a family man. However, as two young girls were about to discover, he was anything but reformed.
So this is a guy who would walk into a pub looking like just anybody else, a normal guy. After work, you'd sit down, you'd have a drink with. There were no clues following that professionals around him felt this was someone that was, in effect, incurable.
In the days before selfies, youngsters used photo booths to capture moments. Nobody knows where in Edinburgh Christine Eady and Helen Scott had this picture taken, but it became an iconic image. Girls excited to be out, their lives ahead of them. In a rare move, a judge in Scotland hearing the case against Sinclair in 2014 allowed cameras to record his summary as he described Christine and Helen's night out.
There was no reason for Christine Eady or Helen Ann Scott to think that 15th October 1977 was going to be particularly eventful. To all intents and purposes, they would have a pleasant Saturday night out, the sort of occasion they would look forward to for many years to come with friends and family, including perhaps children and grandchildren. Helen, shy and retiring, and Christine, more outgoing, had not long left school and started work, no doubt harbouring ambitions of moving on to greater things. It was not made clear in the evidence how Christine saw her future, but we know that Helen wanted to be a children's nurse.
The girls may have harboured grown-up ambitions and felt confident enough to go to a bar, but they had no idea what or who was out there on a dark October night when they may have appeared much older than they were.
Christine and Helen were teenagers who wanted, like every other teenager, to feel grown up. Don't forget, they're at that balance between child and adult, and it's very, very exciting to act like an adult. So they would have walked into that pub thinking, my goodness, so this is what it's like. This is what it's like to kind of, feel grown up and go out with your friends and be a bit sophisticated and have a night out.
They were children, really. They'd made themselves up, got dressed up, and they went out on the town looking for excitement, looking for fun. But the truth is they were defenceless.
I think the irony would have been that these girls felt in control, but actually the variables around them which were putting them in danger would have been things they would have never in a million years considered.
Sinclair and his brother-in-law were in the same pub as Catherine and Helen that evening.
Sinclair and Hamilton latched onto the girls straight away. The girls were out partying, they had a group of friends around them at the pub, they were having fun and they were planning to go out for dinner afterwards. But the men talked them into staying, and so they stayed on in the bar.
When Sinclair would have seen them, he would have invariably clocked the fact that they were very young, therefore vulnerable. He would have clocked the fact that they were trying to seem more sophisticated and older, therefore probably more open to speaking to someone who was giving them attention, who seemed like an older person. That would have worked to his benefit. And I think in general, it probably would have appealed to that very sadistic, controlling aspect of his behavior, the idea that these are people I can subjugate and control very easily.
Whatever dreams they had, they turned into nightmares shortly after they left the World's End pub. Little were they to know that they had the misfortune to be in the company of two men for whom the words evil and monster seem inadequate.
It's horrific thinking about the level of torture and violence that these young girls endured, and how different their night started to where it ended up. It started full of hope, almost full of mischief, thinking, we're doing something that maybe we shouldn't. We're going to a pub and we're a couple of years younger, and our parents said we couldn't, but we could, and then this whole shift to darkness and that realization of having absolutely no control and being in the grasp of somebody who was actually enjoying their fear, who was enjoying their pain. It's a horrible thing to even contemplate.
To this day, nobody knows exactly what happened to Christine and Helen. Had they been laughing and joking right up to the moment that they realized things were not what they seemed?
So the moment you are confronted with something that's in complete opposition to what you expected, it's a complete shock. And that's where the fear must have genuinely set in. That's where the horror and the terror for these girls, because not only were they experiencing this terrible violence, but I think at the same time, it would have been such a shock to them. It would have been outside their repertoire of what this night would have looked like.
At some point, those poor girls must have known that their lives were in danger.
This was something that had never entered their consciousness. So you're not only dealing with the horror and the terror and the physicality of what's going on, but psychologically, it must have almost felt unreal what was happening to them.
They were never seen alive again.
The bodies were found on desolate fields miles apart in the East Lothian area of Scotland. Both were naked. They had been bound and gagged, raped and strangled. What was clear was the brutality that the girls had experienced.
Serial killers are often motivated by extreme sexual fantasies, often involving power. They enjoy the power to make their victim suffer. And some of them, including Sinclair, like close contact, to actually hold the victim, perhaps look into their eyes as they take their last breath.
The girls were subjected to an ordeal beyond comprehension and then left like carrion, exposed for all to see with no dignity, even in death.
Police were to consider 500 suspects over the following 6 months before, absent any significant progress, they scaled down the search for the girls' killers.
It was a difficult time for detectives. They had no DNA profiling, they had no security cameras. Fingerprints were a possibility, but there were none on the clothes that were discarded. They had eyewitness statements to the effect that the girls had left the pub with 2 men, but their descriptions of the men were not especially helpful.
The coat worn by Helen and Christine's jumpsuit were left abandoned along with other items of their clothing at the murder scenes. Detectives hoped that science would one day find a way of revealing the killers' identities.
Angus Sinclair was actually considered as a suspect, but he was based in Glasgow. He appeared to have an alibi, and although he had killed before, it was when he was a teenager, and by now he was apparently reformed and a family man, and so he slipped through the net. Detectives dismissed him as a probable suspect.
Sinclair was married, but with a wife who apparently knew nothing of what her husband was doing when out at night. She loyally stays at home, watches TV, waits up late. Angus is just out with her brother, but she has no way of knowing the full story. What was going on inside the mind of Angus Robertson Sinclair?
Sinclair was a meticulous planner. He had demonstrated that all those years ago with the little girl that supposedly fell down the stairs. And it's probable that before he abducted the 2 girls at the World's End pub, he knew exactly where he was going to go with them and what he was going to do. He was clever enough to formulate a plan and carry it through without being detected.
Angus Sinclair was on the loose, not suspected of having committed any crime, yet showing all the hallmarks of becoming a serial killer. What did the authorities know of Angus Sinclair's background? He was born in 1945, Glasgow. He was the youngest of 3 siblings brought up by their mother, their father having left. His brother John has said that nobody could control the boy.
John actually described Angus as not being this way because he fell in with bad company, but rather that he was the bad company. He was the person you wouldn't want your kids to hang out with. He was the one that had it in him to be bad.
By the time he had reached his teens, the young Angus Sinclair had stolen from the offertory box of his local Catholic church. He had broken into houses. He had become involved in a range of petty crimes, which meant that he was well known to the local police.
Nothing was off limits to Sinclair. He stole from the Catholic Church with not an iota of conscience, just as he had no remorse with the killing of the little girl all of those years ago.
And this was the man that the police knew all about, but who the system allowed to be free. 1977, the year Christine and Helen were killed, saw a series of other horrific murders of women. The first victim was a 37-year-old woman called Frances Barker from Glasgow. In June of 77, she was abducted, raped, bound around the hands and feet, and then strangled using a ligature made from her own clothes.
The first victim, Frances Barker, lived on a road where Sinclair had also lived. So you have a man known to be a killer, known to be obsessed with sex, and known to have lived in the same road as a woman who had been raped and murdered.
But the police seem not to have suspected that Sinclair was involved. Instead, they arrested another man, lorry driver Thomas Ross Young.
There's no doubt this was a very, very bad man.
And the evidence did suggest that that was the man who had killed Frances Barker.
Strands of Frances Barker's hair were found in the cab of the lorry. And then he told the police that in fact he suffered blackouts. He couldn't remember anything in retrospect. And then to add to the evidence, items of Frances Barker, things that had belonged to her, were found in Thomas Young's house.
In 1977, it really did look as though the police had got their man.
Young was tried and convicted of a range of offences, including the murder of Frances Barker. He was sentenced to life. Angus Sinclair was not a suspect, but Thomas Young never admitted killing Frances Barker.
Young spent 37 years in prison, denying that he was the killer. He protested his innocence until the day that he died.
The conviction of Young for the murder of Frances Barker remains hugely contested in Scotland. Many, including some in the police force, believe that Young was innocent. His arrest left a man on the streets who would be free to kill. Angus Sinclair. 7 weeks after the murder of Frances Barker, a 20-year-old Anna Kenny, also from Glasgow, disappeared. It would be another 18 months before her body was discovered on land near to where Sinclair had spent his honeymoon. She had been raped and strangled before her body was dumped in remote countryside. And then a further 6 weeks passed before the discovery of another Glasgow woman's body, Hilda Macaulay, again discovered in a remote area, again a victim raped and murdered. The next attacks and murders of women took place in October of 1977, the World's End murders of Christine and Helen, but they were not to be the last brutally killed that year. Agnes Cooney, a 23-year-old nurse from Glasgow, was killed in December.
Looking back, it seems inconceivable that this series of attacks and rapes would not be linked, but they were not, and Sinclair was not considered a suspect for any of them.
Angus Sinclair had raped and killed a young girl, been described as beyond treatment and sex-obsessed, and was living in Glasgow and working both there and in Edinburgh. In 1 year, 6 women had been attacked, raped and murdered in the Glasgow and Edinburgh areas. Yet Sinclair was not under suspicion for the deaths, and seemed to have an alibi for at least 2 murders. His behaviour throughout the year gave no cause for suspicion.
At this point in his life, Sinclair actually goes completely under the radar. He ticks all the boxes of a normal guy. He's got a job that he's holding down. He'd learned how to be a painter and decorator in prison, so he kind of takes on that job. He plays sports with his friends. It's actually quite a popular guy. You know, it's the kind of person you want to hang out with. A lot of his contemporaries said he's married. He's absolutely the guy next door.
But Sinclair was the guy next door who was also the man of your worst nightmares. It was now 1978, a year he began a series of sex attacks.
At least 10 children were attacked over a period of 4 years, abducted or raped, all of them left totally traumatized.
There were plenty in Scotland who thought they had a serial attacker on their hands, one who showed no mercy to his victims. But again, Sinclair went about his daily business without any outward sign of stress or guilt. 2 girls attacked during this time managed to escape. One would later describe her ordeal at the hands of her attacker. He had lured her into a tenement.
What is interesting about how this woman reported her experience of being attacked as a child is that it appeared to have Sinclair's mode of operation, that one-on-one relationship.
He asked her to do him a favour. He said, "Could you please deliver some change back to a flat that he pointed out to her? And remember that this had happened also with Catherine. He'd asked her to come back to his mother's flat after running an errand."
But when she reached the flat, her attacker pounced, holding a knife to her throat and telling her to do exactly what he said.
This little girl managed to escape, but it was remarkable because the pattern of what happened was exactly the same as what had happened to Catherine Rehill.
Eventually, police and prosecutors were able to arrest Sinclair. One of his victims had noticed that her attacker had specks of paint in his hair, and police arrested the painter and decorator Sinclair. They built a case against him which would see him sent to prison for life for 3 rape offences and 7 of indecent assault. But before that happened in 1978, Sinclair had met 17-year-old Mary Gallagher in Glasgow. He hadn't known her before coming across her in a pub in the city. Nobody notices him when he's talking to her. Nobody sees him tracking her every move. That night, she doesn't make it home. She simply disappears. Had Mary Gallagher become the latest victim of Angus Sinclair, serial killer? (1982), and Angus Sinclair is imprisoned for rape and the sexual abuse of 11 children. It was unlikely this already convicted killer would ever be released, but some in the Scottish police believed that he was guilty of a lot more than he'd been convicted for. Some were beginning to suspect he was responsible for the 1977 murder of at least 5 women.
There was a pattern to these attacks. They all involved women who'd gone to the pub and were going for a drink. They always involved a man who must have known Glasgow and Edinburgh. They involved bodies that had been found bound and gagged, and the bodies were dumped and found in very remote areas. It happened over 18 months. That's not very long. It seems extraordinary to think that nobody thought to link these things together.
The key moment in the case against Sinclair was to take place when he volunteered to join other prisoners in giving his DNA to police as part of a project to compile a British national database.
Science has been extraordinarily important. It's found the key to unravelling what happened inside Angus Sinclair's mind.
The last victim in the series of murders of women which had taken place in the late 70s was Mary Gallagher.
Mary Gallagher is this sweet 17-year-old, comes from a really loving family, very confident, interestingly enough, probably because she came from such a loving environment where people were kind and nice. Her threat level, her idea about threat would have been really minimal. She didn't have any reason to believe that the world was anything other than a perfectly safe place. So on that fateful day when Mary decides to take a shortcut, she would never have dreamt what was waiting for her.
Her killer had snatched her. She was violently raped and then her throat was cut. Experts believed that she died seconds later. Her body was dumped in remote countryside.
It seems that the killer subdued her with a ligature before he carried on the attack.
The nature of the attack on Mary suggests something about the mind of the killer. He does not threaten her with a gun, but uses a knife, so that he is actually holding her in close contact with her. And the violence with which he raped her suggests a man with a need for total control.
What we think happened is that as Mary walked, she was attacked. She was probably hit quite hard on the face, given the evidence. She was raped, and then she was strangled using her own trousers, which suggests that this attack went on. It was sustained. It also suggests it was very violent, and that there's a level of sadism involved here. This young girl set out to visit a friend, and she was confronted with the horror and the violence that was Sinclair. And again, we're reminded of that original psychiatrist report that said that he would be dangerous, in effect, for the foreseeable future.
Mary Gallagher was killed in November 1978, a year since the World's End killings. By the time Sinclair was sentenced to the sex attacks on children in 1982, nobody had ever been charged with her murder. In the 80s, Sinclair had given a DNA sample. Meanwhile, police had kept a range of evidence from the death of Mary Gallagher. By the late 90s, sampling techniques had advanced sufficiently to recover a DNA profile from a hair kept from Mary's body. It matched that of Angus Sinclair. Detectives confronted him with their evidence.
Sinclair is confronted by the police, who now have evidence, clear DNA evidence, that he was at the scene, and he loses it. He literally buckles at the knees, has to sit down. He's in complete shock. And the police says, great, the policeman is quoted as saying, okay, I thought, that's it, I have him. It's DNA, he was there. And he still refuses to say he was part of this crime. Not only does he refuse to say it at that point, but even when he's pressed, even for years afterwards, he refuses to tell the family that he was a part of it, what happened, thus not allowing them the closure that they deserve. Even with this huge amount of evidence, he still wants to be in control. This is still his game plan. I'm going to say I didn't do it. And don't forget, all those years ago, the only person that managed to get him to confront what he did was his brother. Again, the police leaned on him. They really tried to go hard to get him to confess. He never moved. He never twitched. And even in the face of DNA evidence 20 years later, this is not about taking any sense of accountability. This is not about anything other than this man wanting to gain sexual violent gratification and not caring about the effect that it had on anyone.
By refusing to admit his guilt, Sinclair ensured that Mary's family would go through the ordeal of a court case with all of the horrific facts of her final hours being recounted to a jury, who, mercifully for Mary's family, took little time in finding him guilty. Having faced the courts as a teenage boy, a minor in the eyes of the law, he was, 40 years later, convicted of murder.
The original psychiatrist had said all along that there was nothing that could be done to treat Sinclair medically, to change him from the dangerous, sex-obsessed, violent person that he was. And that psychiatrist was proved all too tragically right with respect to the murder of Mary Gallagher.
The key question: was Sinclair also responsible for the series of other rapes and murders in Scotland in the late 1970s? Damagingly, none of the evidence in the murders of Francis Barker, Hilda McCauley, Agnes Cooney or Anna Kenny had been kept, but the evidence in the deaths of Christine Eadie and Helen Scott had.
He now knows, by virtue of the fact that the police have his DNA evidence, that he will be linked to other crimes. So does he own up and say, do you know what, this is what happened? No, not a chance.
Sinclair was already in jail for life for sexually assaulting children and for murder, but he may have harboured in the back of his mind an idea that one day, however old, he might get parole, and so he was unhelpful in confessing to any of the other crimes that had occurred in the 70s.
Helen Scott had worn a coat on that chilly night. It was found abandoned next to her body. On it, stains, which a quarter of a century later would yield enough of a DNA sample to link her death to Angus Robertson Sinclair.
In the end, DNA was discovered, his and his brother-in-law's, and so science was able to prove that they were at the scene of the attack.
You think of how many families whose actions will have irrevocably affected, destroyed in many ways. And does he confess? Absolutely not. Now, why is this? Is it a last semblance of control? Is it that last bit of control? Is he getting a high off of knowing that he's still causing pain? If this person, as psychiatrist described, was in fact sadistic, sadism comes in many different forms. It's not just physical, it can be psychological. So the idea that someone else is still in pain because of what I'm doing, years later, miles away, would have still made him feel good. Perhaps that was why.
In the end, not only does Sinclair deny the murders, but he accuses the girls of consenting to sex. Effectively, he wanted to pin it onto his brother-in-law, who was dead.
One of the most telling aspects of his personality and this narcissistic nature of him being able to control everyone and him being smarter than everyone was when he was confronted with the DNA evidence of the World's End murders. And he said, yeah, no, the evidence was there because I had sex with both of them that night. Clearly, I didn't do anything else.
Sinclair was charged, but what happened next was to cause great controversy. The new DNA evidence was not offered to the court, which, without it, dismissed the case. Sinclair was returned to prison to complete his other sentences. It took a change in the local Scottish law to allow suspects to be tried a second time for the same offence, scrapping the so-called double jeopardy defence to convict Sinclair. New DNA advances meant that even more of Sinclair's DNA and samples of his skin were found on the clothes of the murdered girls. But back in court, he again refused to confess.
In all this time, with all the pressure from detectives and police and the media, this man has never confessed. In fact, the only time that someone has an effect on him is when his brother sat him down and said, you've got to say what you did all those years ago to that little girl. After that, there was no sense of conscience, there was no sense of empathy, of anything. And that's what the trial judge picks up on. And when he sentences him, he says precisely that this person was psychopathic, that he had no empathy, no conscience. And that's what made him a serial killer.
Now an old man, Sinclair stood impassively as the jury delivered its verdict. Guilty. Sinclair's notoriety is perhaps why the judge decided his summary of what had happened to Helen and Christine should be filmed as he passed sentence.
The nightmare for their families and friends, on the other hand, has gone on from those first awful moments when they heard the news no one should hear, until even now, 37 years later and counting. It will never end. No one who saw the evidence of Helen's father, sisters and boyfriend and Christine's mother could fail to have been moved by it. They are an example to us all, waiting patiently for justice while the authorities have worked tirelessly to achieve it. As for you, you have displayed not 1 ounce of remorse for these terrible deeds. The evidence in this case, as well as your record, details of which have now been revealed, shows that you are a dangerous predator who is capable of sinking to the depths of depravity. I do not intend to waste many words on you. You are well aware that the only sentence I can pass is one of life imprisonment.
The judge went on to ensure that the 70-year-old Sinclair will never be released by ordering that parole cannot be considered for 37 years.
Unless one day your conscience, if you have one, motivates you to tell the truth, no one other than you will ever know precisely what part you and Gordon Hamilton played in these awful events.
But what of the other murders? Will Sinclair ever be brought before the justice system to face trial for their deaths?
The women were killed in exactly the same way as Christine, Mary and Helen, the murders for which Angus Sinclair is now serving a life sentence. But there are plenty who believe that he should answer questions about at least 3 other deaths.
And you have to think, again, his belief about himself, being able to orchestrate all this, and his need to stay in control, overriding anyone else's need. The parents need to know what happened, the needs of the families to come to terms with this, the needs of the police to close these cases, anyone else around him. None of that. He had a very psychopathic, narcissistic personality and was never going to think about anyone else's needs in any of this. It was all about him.
Angus Robertson Sinclair has been convicted of killing 4 women along with a series of sex crimes. The murders of 4 more women, killed almost exactly the same way as Sinclair's victims, remain unsolved. One case of rape and murder, which had been thought solved, is under review. Justice is at times slow, but for some of the women murdered in Scotland in the late 70s, justice has arrived, with the sentence facing Angus Robertson Sinclair.
For them at least, the nightmare is over, and if they were not resting in peace before today, I hope that they are now.